So, figure this out, how to... Oh, here we go. Okay. So, the top 10 teachings. Number 1 is about purity obtained through the sunset. The number 2, I'm going to explain all of these, so I'm going to review them all. Number 2 is the opinion, and this is all talking about when we say the Shema in the evening. And basically, there's 5 opinions on this page of Talmud about how we identify the time that we recite the evening Shema. So the first opinion is Rabbi Eliezer, and he says it's when we sanctify the Shabbos. And the next one, number 3, which is the second opinion, is Rabbi Yoshua, when the Kohanim would become pure to eat cheruma, which is special food that that the people who would have crops would designate for the priests in Eretz Yisrael. And then number 4, which is the third opinion in this of the 5, is Rabbi Meir, who says that we would read the Shema when the Kohanim would go to the mikvah before evening to be able to eat truma, which is obviously a little earlier than when they would be actually eating the truma or able to eat the truma. And then number 5, which is the fourth opinion, is Rabbi Hanania, who says when poor people go to eat bread and salt. And number 6, which is the fifth opinion, the final opinion on this page, when a person would, when we read the evening Shema, is Rabbi Achai, when it says normal people eat. We're going to break that all down later. Number 7 is the idea that Rashi introduces here of the concept of bein hashmashot. Bein hashmashot means between day and night, and how that applies to Friday night and the sanctification of time, and that the question of what that means, the bein hashmashot, what's the status of that in halacha. Number 8 is understanding Talmudic logic, how they initially understood something. Havamina, it's called, the initial understanding, versus the maskana, the final understanding, and we're going to use when it is that a poor person would eat, the initial versus final understanding to explain that. Number 9 is the concept of the time a person lies down, not necessarily an objective, subjective time, but creating an objective time to identify the evening of reciting the Shema versus just identifying when it's night. Number 10 is this particular concept of bein hashmashot, this in-between day and night, according to one particular opinion, is but a moment. It's a very complicated concept in other places, not so much here, of how long bein hashmashot is, that continues to have a variety of opinions and practices even till today. So let's go that over and delve into the second side of page 2 of Talmud Brachot. Okay, so the idea here, the main idea here is that we're looking for identifying a time that is considered the evening, so that one can be obligated to recite the Shema. Reciting the Shema in general is associated with the concept of what we call Kabbalat Ol Malchus Shamayim, which means shifting your consciousness to a value, a supreme value of God being what's most important to you, and that underlying theme then begins to give your life meaning. So, in other words, a lot of us, for example, we're preoccupied with a livelihood. We have to make money to pay our bills and take care of the people we love, and take care of ourselves as well. But the question is, do we have something even beyond that? Is that our final kind of destination, just survival? Or is there some purpose that we're here? So the very beginning of what the Torah teaches us is that there is a purpose. We're here to serve. We're here to serve not just other people, but we're here to serve our divine calling. And that concept is called recognizing that there's some bigger power. We call that power God. I know people. I just watched Star Wars, so Star Wars is its own kind of religious symbolisms and words like the Force. But in Judaism, we have this idea of one God, and we dedicate ourselves to Him every evening and every morning with the recitation of the Shema. So what I'm primarily going to be talking about today is using the work of Reb Tzadok, the disciple of the Man Shiloach, one of my favorite Hasidic Rebbes, who really inspired me to Reb Tzadok, and even more the Man Shiloach, to analyze the Talmudic opinions with a kind of psychology where it's not simply identifying times. It is also identifying times, different opinions of when one is obligated to recite the evening Shema, but equally it's identifying the inner processes. So we're going to be going through some of those inner processes that help one get ready. Some of the rabbis argue about it because the question is, you don't necessarily want to set the bar too high, because then it becomes an elite faith that very few people can really practice. On the other hand, you don't want to set it too low, because then what's the point of it? So that's part of the way I understand kind of the struggle between these different opinions. So let's jump in here. So there's this concept of the sun setting. There's a lot of laws about ritual purity, and it seems strange that they would enter into the first tractate of the Talmud, which really doesn't have much to do with ritual purity. It has to do with the nature of prayer and blessings and reciting of the Shema and the grace after meals. But it does enter into this tractate right away. The Talmud itself says the methodology is in part to teach us, like to inform about other elements of Torah. In other words, when we study one part of Torah, it shouldn't be divorced from the other parts. It shouldn't be as if like they're different Torahs. A lot of people, including myself, sometimes want to avoid the parts of Torah that we don't see as kind of relevant to today. And since the laws of purity, by and large, are not practiced without the temple, a lot of people don't want to spend much time studying them. But we're almost like forced to, because of the nature of the way the Talmud brings it right back, even when it doesn't have to, it purposefully does. So here the concept is, number one, is a Kohen is given trumos, is a special tithe that we give to the priestly clan, and they have to eat it in a state of purity. I'm not going to get into what makes one impure, but I'll just say, the type of impurity we're talking about here, the person would have to go to a mikvah. By the way, even when somebody has to be purified because they came into contact with a mate, with a corpse, and they have the third and the seventh day, they're sprinkled with the para aduma, the red heifer water, they're still going to have to go to the mikvah in the evening, on the final day, or late towards the evening of the final day, and then they'll become pure, and they'll be able to eat a truma. Now, there's another type of food called kudshim. Kudshim are the sacrificial foods. That is stricter. That the Kohen, when he became a tamei mate, when he became ritually defiled by a corpse, or the other laws, similar laws of tumat mate, he would not only have to become ritually pure and go to the mikvah at the end of that period, he would also have to bring the next day an offering. Notice that's not the level of purity. The Talmud makes a specific kind of argument that we don't need that purity here. We're not looking for that purity. To be able to eat truma, all you need is to go to the mikvah and the sun to set for it to get dark. Again, sunsetting, getting dark, that's kind of a complicated area. We're going to call that time period in between sunset and a nightfall of the stars coming out. At some point in that time period is called bein hashmashot, but we're not going to deal with that now. We'll deal with it a little bit later, and then more even as we get into the tractate. So what does this mean psychologically, this concept of not having to bring an offering? Let's talk about what bringing an offering means. We know that when a person does something wrong, there's two elements of fixing themselves in what we call tshuva, return, spiritually correcting oneself. One is that one has to make a statement, to inner resolve not to go back to that sin, and from henceforth to keep away from that negative behavior. But there's a second part, which is an act that kind of countermeasures the negative act by a positive act, and that somehow brings you back into your equilibrium. So, for example, if you insulted a very good friend, you could apologize and tell them that you feel terrible and you will never talk to them that way. But if you really wanted to do a full tshuva, you would also give them a gift, a token of like you really hurt them, and that not only are you apologizing verbally, maybe you hurt them in a way that like stung so deeply, you have to do something positive to reinforce your commitment to never hurt them again. That gift is, the rabbis considered that a carbon offering we'd bring in the temple. So that was like a step in the tshuva process. So the concept here is that when you want to recite the Shema in the evening, you might think that you have to really clean your soul out. You really have to fix yourself and do a complete tshuva, do a complete repentance, which would involve not only a commitment to do good and not to go back, not to backslide, but also to do an act that represents an act of repentance. And here the Talmud comes and tells us that you don't have to wait to do the act. You can just make up your mind to do the right thing in the future. That's enough to be able to go back. But there's one thing that you do need, which is Erev Shemesh, the sun setting, nightfall, meaning you need to change your mindset, which the night versus day represents a new time. And Maimonides says that part of the tshuva process is to become new, to renew yourself, to not be the same as you were before. So that represents just being able to change. I'm no longer that person. It's no longer that day. It's a new day. I'm a new person. I'm not going to go back to that. Okay, so that's that meaning. That's number one. Number two is the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, who says, when do we begin to eat? When do we recite the evening Shema? And he says, when we sanctify Shabbat on Friday evening. Rashi explains that what that means is that on Friday evening, at some point, the sun sets. It's not yet dark, but it's not yet day either. We call that period, as I mentioned before, bein hashmashot. We call that period this kind of, in between the sun setting and the evening. And since we don't know whether it's Shabbat or still late Friday afternoon, out of doubt, we sanctify Shabbos. We could already make Kiddush. We can already pray then. In fact, we're obligated at that point to bring in Shabbos. It's not even considered bringing in Shabbos early per se, because since it may be Shabbos, we accept Shabbos at that point. It may well be early. We don't know, but that kind of makes us sanctify the Shabbos. Now, the idea of sanctifying time, we know Mikadesh Yisrael, Mikadesh Yisrael b'hasmanim, that we are sanctified. We have a divine sanctity that allows us to sanctify a holy day. Particularly, we sanctify the holidays. But even Shabbos, where the Kedusha, the holiness of Shabbos, is set to some extent, when we bring it in, we have an element of our ability to bring it in early, or at the very least, as Rashi indicates here, we bring it in when it may be Shabbos, even if it isn't with certainty. What that represents is it's already evening when we create sanctity as a people out of doubt. So that again tells us that our ability to sanctify time creates a halachic reality, and that is when Rabbi Yeshua says we would recite the Shema. The number 3. That number 2 was Rabbi Eliezer. Number 3 is Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua says something that sounds like the Mishnah, but it's slightly different. Some opinions say it's the same. Other opinions say it's slightly off from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says when the Kohanim eat Teruma, Rabbi Yeshua said when Kohanim become Tahor to eat Truma. He may mean just the moment of purity, and then it takes them another moment or two to be able to actually eat the Truma. What that represents is the Mishnah, perhaps, let's take, for argument's sake, say that the Mishnah and Rabbi Yeshua don't agree, although they may very well, but let's just assume they don't for the sake of this teaching. The Mishnah says when they actually eat Truma, and Rabbi Yeshua says when they become fit or pure to be able to eat Truma, meaning right before they actually sit down to eat. There's usually a few moments before you actually eat. So what that would mean is that Rabbi Yeshua says, you don't have to over-prepare to be able to recite the Shema. As soon as you become pure, you don't have to sit and meditate beforehand, although there are some people who say you certainly do. But he would say Shema itself is a preparation. It readies you to it readies you to improve who you are throughout the evening, and then in the morning throughout the day. So because of that, as soon as you're able to do something, even before you actually do it, you're allowed to recite and should be able to recite the Shema. That's number 3. Number 4 is Rabbi Meir says it's actually a little bit earlier when you could recite the Shema. It's not when the Kohanim become pure or when they eat the actual Teruma, but when they're in the mikvah, which is the earliest opinion, really. That when it's still really the day before when they can go to the mikvah, and they could already eat Teruma then. Number 5 is which to me represents the idea of the mikvah, the power of the mikvah, the power of immersing yourself in something. When a person goes to the mikvah, they lose their past, so to speak. They become renewed in this pure water. Number 5 is Rabbi Hanania, who says when a poor person goes to eat bread and salt. Now, what's interesting about that is that's not clear when it is. Initially, the Gemara thinks that that's an earlier time, because poor people don't have light to eat by, so they eat before it would get dark. And then eventually, the opinion that's accepted is that it's a later time from when regular people eat, because I guess poor people, I don't know, I don't quite understand it. I'll explain it the best that I can in a moment. In one of the other things, in number 8, I'm going to explain why the Gemara changes its mind. I don't want to get it. I actually do know, but I'm not going to get into it right now. But that idea is a little bit, we should be aware of what poor people are doing. A lot of times we're only thinking about ourselves, and the Gemara, that opinion is saying, think about other people who are hungry. When would they go to eat? That would help us identify the time of the evening that we recite the evening Shema. Now we get to number 6, which is Rabbi Achai. He says we would recite the evening Shema when normal people eat their meal. Now, what's interesting about that is it's so normal. Every other opinion is not a normal opinion. It has to do with priests. It has to do with poor people. It has to do with Shabbos being sanctified. And all of a sudden, it's like when normal people go and eat. And that's also interesting because a lot of people think that their lives are only worthwhile if they're a Kohen, a priest, or they're poor. There's some story, they're always struggling. But the truth is, normal isn't necessarily a bad thing. We can sanctify normal. It's okay to be normal. And that's why I think it's an interesting opinion to have normal people represented as well. Now we get to number 7, which is a very interesting Rashi. What does Rashi say? I'll show you Rashi. Let's see if I can turn this around. No, that's the wrong button. Here's the button I want to press. It's not working. No, that's something else. Oh, here it is. Okay. So this is a Rashi about the Friday afternoon. Okay. So Rashi says, what does he say? I don't usually look at the Gemara just through a camera. Let's see. I'm going to have to look at it this other way. This is tiny words. Sefer B'Ligamas Nisan. Oh. Okay, here, this Rashi here. Misha Shekidish Hayom Ba'arve Shabbosos. When we sanctify the day on Friday evening. So Rashi says, Hainu ben Hashmashos. That's the period that we call this in-between period. Safek Yom, Safek Laila. It's a question, is it day or is it night? The kibbutz is Safeku, Kiddush Hayom is Safek. And since it's a question, it's a doubt, when in doubt, we sanctify the day. We bring in Shabbos, we sanctify Shabbos out of doubt. Okay, so let's talk about that for a moment. I mentioned that earlier, but here I want to talk about this idea of doubt. In general, there's a question of what is a doubt in halacha. So there's a ritva that explains the following. One way to understand a doubt is simply that we're not sure. So because we don't know, we play it safe. We take on the stringencies of whichever direction it could possibly be in. So for example, on Friday towards evening, since it may be Shabbos, we treat it like Shabbos. Saturday towards evening, since it may be Shabbos, maybe Saturday night, we still treat it like Shabbos. That's why we say Shabbos is 25 hours. Really, technically, Shabbos is only 24 hours. We just don't know how to identify when it should start and finish. So out of astringency, we make it 25 hours. Anyway, another way of looking at it is sometimes something, and this is what the Ritva actually says, has elements of both. It kind of has that time period has an element of day and has an element of night. So it's not just that we don't know what it is. We know that it's two things that are different. So therefore we have to take on both elements. And there are a number of things in halacha that it may not just be simply a question of what it is, but it may actually be two things that are not really traditionally practiced or treated in the same way, and therefore creates a new reality. So that's something about Bein Hashmashot that may be, according to some opinions, more than just a simple question of is it day or is it night. It may be a time that is day and night together. Or it may just be a question of what is it. Now, number 8 is, I mentioned before that the Gemara had one opinion. Initially, it thought that a poor person eats before regular people. And the And the reason is simple. Rashi explains, because poor people don't have light. They didn't have firewood. They didn't have oil. They didn't have anything. So they presumably eat while there was still a little bit of light out. So that would be, especially in the winter, that'd be quite early. Wealthier people, might wait for it to be darker, and they still could. They wouldn't wait too late, because it was an inconvenience for people to travel and so on in the dark. They didn't have streetlights. Everything we have today is very different in that sense than the period of the Talmud, because we have electricity. So part of studying Talmud is realizing a little bit of what people lived with 1,000, 2,000 years ago, when the Talmud was written 2,000 to 1,600 years ago. And then the commentaries, the vast majority of the commentaries lived at a time where they didn't have electricity. So the logic makes sense. The problem is they then bring down a brisa. Brisa is like a form of a Mishnaic teaching that wasn't included in the Mishnah, and they analyze the variety of opinions, and they the fact that they each have a separate opinion means they can't be repeating themselves. They have to be talking about different periods of time, and by analysis, it comes out that that it makes more sense to be able to fit into the brisa that poor people don't eat earlier, because that opinion is already taken by, I believe, the opinion that said when the Kohanim go to the mikvah, which is also when it's still a little bit light out. So since we can't have those two opinions agreeing with each other, because they by very nature are disagreeing if they're both listed separately, we're kind of forced to say that the poor person must be a later period than even regular people eating. So almost like we start off assuming something. The assumption is based on logic. The problem is when that logic is tested by analysis, we then bend the logic to fit in with analysis, which is interesting. You say, what do you mean? That doesn't make any sense? Well, it does. If you try to line up those opinions and it doesn't work without pushing that period into later, we're going to push that period into later. So that's one of many examples of how the Talmud analyzes something. Starts with a havamina, it starts with a presumption that upon further analysis doesn't hold out, even though there's a logic to why they thought like that. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, it doesn't win out. Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you. There'll be others like that as we study more Talmud. And the number 9 and 10. Number 9 is this page of the Gemara is a little bit different than last page. And at this page, almost everyone, maybe even all 5 of these opinions of what nightfall is, are not really talking about. They're not clearly just saying Tzeta Kochavim, when the stars come out. Last page, the first page of the Talmud says that when do we recite the Shema in the evening? When the Kohanim eat their Truma, which is when Tzeta Kochavim, when the stars come out. And here they're giving all these other kind of ways that are around that time, before that time, maybe at that time, but not just clearly saying Tzeta Kochavim. That word never comes up in this side of the page. And most of the commentaries say the following thing, and Rashi brings it down as well. See what Rashi says. Rashi says, Diktani hacha adshat she'omed lipatim b'tech hasuda v'hanu the darish v'shachra tchilas man shchiva. That what we're doing here is our page is dealing with the textual exegesis on the focus on the word lying down or going to sleep, which implies there is a kind of time period that people go to sleep. Our Mishnah, on the other hand, Actually, no, it's not the Rashi, but it's all over. The concept stands. It's just not the Rashi I'm reading. The concept is as follows: the Mishnah learns it out from night. When is night? Like an objective thing. Now is nighttime. The sun, the stars are out. It's nighttime. The Gemara here, which is quoting a brisa on our page, is focused more on the time people go to sleep, which has a certain subjective quality, not really subjective, not when you individually go to sleep, but when the general population goes to sleep. That would be when we recite the Shema in the evening. The question that would become, now that we have electricity, does that change? The answer is no. Why? Because if we start changing that, we're going to change a lot of things. The Reb Tzadok HaKohen actually explains that both opinions agree that going to sleep and nightfall have to be in relationship to one another. That's how we understand human nature. Perhaps the chiddush, the newness of electricity, and even now the digital age, is really interfering with our sleep, the natural order of how we would sleep. So maybe studying the Talmud reminds us of that challenge, so to speak, of what do we do now that we live with 24/7 electricity? What do we do now, even worse, that we have access to entertainment and connectivity 24/7? That's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not a natural order of things. So the natural order the Talmud is reminding us is there's a time of going to sleep which is associated with evening, with nightfall. The first page of the Talmud just focuses purely on a kind of objective nightfall, and the second page creates some subjectivity to when society as a whole goes to sleep, but still is overall objective, where once that time is established, that remains the time, doesn't change based on different norms in different societies. Possibly you could argue that in a place where the sun never sets, maybe at that, maybe you could say that community would kind of see when the sun gets lower and when people go to sleep, and that's when they would recite the Shema. A final one, number 10 for today, is this concept of one of the rabbis saying, Rabbi Meir saying that I hold that Ben Hashmashot, that in between period between day and night, is only a moment. That idea of Ben Hashmashot being only a moment is not at all what we follow in halacha. In fact, many opinions follow Rabbeinu Tam that says that period is up to 72 or 50 something minutes. It's a long time. The Vilna Gaon and others don't have quite as long a time as Rabbeinu Tam. But I like this idea of keharef ayin, about a moment, because it represents the concept that we say that change can happen more quickly than you think. A lot of people are living in this kind of twilight zone between day and night or night and day and think it's taking forever. And there's always hope because good things happen. Like we say, Mashiach could come, keharef ayin, and what do you keharef ayin is like when you blink, a moment. Thank you for watching.